On July 5, 2009, rioting broke out in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang, after days of rising tension between Uyghurs, the dominant or the largest ethnic group in Xinjiang, and Han Chinese, the dominant ethnic group in China. The clashes began when the police confronted a protest march held by Uyghurs to demand a full government investigation of a brawl between between Uyghur and Han workers in a toy factory on June 25th in Shaoguan, Guangdong province, 1,800 miles away from Xinjiang. 2 Uyghur men were killed and 120 injured in the violence at the factory. Many Uyghurs believe that the government did too little to investigate the incident, and anger about the government's perceived lack of action was the spark leading to the renewed violence in Urumqi on July 5th. At least 197 people were killed and 1,600 injured, most of them Han civilians, when Uyghurs went on a rampage that night, according to the government, the Chinese government. Vengeful Han then attacked Uyghurs over the next few days. Many Uyghurs in Urumqi say the government has severely undercounted the Uyghur casualties. Even the official casualty toll makes this the deadliest outbreak of violence in China in many years. So that's the immediate context for this symposium, and we have 4 incredibly distinguished panelists to discuss this from a variety of perspectives. I will provide all their introductions now, and we will proceed, or I'll introduce them in the order that they will speak, and we'll proceed with the program. We'll have about 10 or 15 minutes presentation by each panelist, and then we'll go to questions and answers. Our first speaker will be James Millward. James Millward is Professor of Intersocietal History in the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He specializes on the modern history of China and Central Asia, including Mongolia, Tibet, and especially Xinjiang. He also teaches world history, and his current research combines Central Eurasia and world perspectives by following the paths of stringed instruments and musical exchanges along the Silk Roads and globally, with a particular focus on the globalization of the guitar over the past 500 years. His publications include, and many of you know particularly his most recent work, Crossroads of Eurasia, A History of Xinjiang, Columbia University Press, 2007. New Qing Imperial History, The Making of Inner Asian Empire at Qingchengde, from Rutledge Corzon in 2004. And Beyond the Past, Economy, Ethnicity, and Empire in Qing Central Asia, 1759-1864, from Stanford University Press. He will be followed by Talent Mohanuli. Mohanuli is a specialist in Central Eurasian Turkic languages and cultures, especially in Turkic Sino-linguistics. He teaches currently in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at the University of Washington. He has a PhD in Turkic linguistics and Central Asian studies from Indiana University, and he has taught Turkic languages and cultures for the past 16 years at Indiana, Wisconsin, and the University of Washington. He's a native of Urumqi, and he has traveled extensively throughout all the Turkic language-speaking areas in China doing field work on Kazakh, Tuvan, Uyghur, and other Turkic languages. And he has published articles and books on sociolinguistic aspects of the Tuvan and Kazakh language situations. Our third speaker will be Gardner Bovington. Gardner Bovington is an assistant professor in the Department of Central Eurasian Studies at Indiana University. He specializes in the study of nationalism and the politics of identity, with a regional focus on Xinjiang, and more broadly on East Asia and Central Asia. He has conducted nearly 2 years of field work in Xinjiang over the course of 1995 to 2002, using both Chinese and Uyghur languages. He has published his research findings in journal articles and book chapters, and has just completed a book manuscript on the politics of contemporary Xinjiang, forthcoming from Columbia University Press. Our final panelist, who probably needs less introduction than any of the others, is Professor Rashad Kasaba, who's the Henry M. Jackson Professor of International Studies at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. He's the author and editor of several books and many articles dealing with the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, and the Middle East. His most recent publications are A Movable Empire, Ottoman Nomads, Migrants, and Refugees, 2009, from University of Washington Press, and he's the editor of the Cambridge History of Modern Turkey, which is volume 4 in that series. Without further ado, let's welcome the panelists and James Millward in particular.
I'm going to recap in a little more detail than David just did what we know and what we suspect happened in June of July last summer, June and July of 2009. I'm going to go pretty fast because David told me he's going to be strict about time, and that's a good thing to do. So it's not a simple matter to recap these events, because from the time the events occurred, all concerned have tried to shape the narrative in ways to support their own political interpretation. This is, of course, nothing new. What makes it significant in this instance is the way the interplay of information in both new and old media and information control have contributed to the violence and led to its continuation in several stages from June through August and September, from Guangdong to Xinjiang. Now, of course, most of the power over communications and information lies with the Chinese state, which mobilized its print and broadcast media to present an official version of events, namely that the World Uyghur Congress used the unfortunate events in the factory in Guangzhou to incite a violent riot in Xinjiang. And also, and the Chinese state has also been able to implement a remarkable and possibly unprecedented effort at a full spectrum media control, communications control in Xinjiang since July 7th. All internet, including email, Skype, Twitter, QQ, Flickr, and other sorts of services like that, and international phone and SMS services have been cut off for months from the region. People have been closely monitored going in and out with reports of searches at the border for digital media and other things like that. House-to-house searches have been carried out widely in Urumqi, and reportedly cell phones, cameras, and anything that can record video have been confiscated. And only a small amount of information other than the official story has come out of Xinjiang. In part, this is aided by cell phone and video posted on YouTube and elsewhere. But this small amount of information, although it is limited and sometimes problematic, hints at aspects that are left out of the official story. All right, I want to begin with the Shaoguan events happening at the Shuri factory. Since at least 2007, Xinjiang and Chinese governments have encouraged and companies have taken advantage of programs to bring Uyghur workers from Xinjiang to provinces in eastern and southern China for employment in factories there. The Shuzhi, or Early Light Toy Factory in Shaoguan in Guangdong, brought in several hundred Uyghur workers starting in May 2009 by means of this labor transfer program. And they housed them in a large dormitory along with Han workers as well, a large dormitory complex. Incidentally or not, the owner of the Early Light factory and the sort of holding company that it's a part of, a man named Francis Choi, is a Hong Kong billionaire and a member of the Chinese Political Consultative Conference. His connections within the PRC government allowed him to weather the lead paint toy scandal a few years ago, when the owner of the only other Guangdong toy factory so implicated, a man named Chong Shuhong, ended up committing suicide on the shop floor of his own factory. Choi's Early Light Industrial Company, on the other hand, benefited from subsequent government promotion and continues for the third year running to be ranked as the world's largest toy manufacturer, producing toys for Hasbro, Mattel, and other companies. Now, according to Xinhua News Service, a Han Chinese former employee of this factory named Zhu had quit the factory. He later wished to return, but was not rehired, and this was around the time that the Uyghur workers had been brought in. So there might have been economic reasons then behind some of the Han-Uyghur tension in Guangdong. As we know, Zhu posted a false report on an internet bulletin board saying that that a Han girl had been raped by Uyghurs. According to another story, though, told to a reporter by people in the factory town and later repeated by Nur Bekri, the head of the Xinjiang government, regional government, a female Han worker had gotten lost in this large dormitory complex, had stumbled into a Uyghur room a room inhabited by Uyghur men, who had somehow frightened her, or she had become frightened, and screamed. And then a rumor spread that she had been raped. So there's slightly different stories. They may not be mutually exclusive, however. On the 26th of June, Han workers stormed the Uyghur dorms armed with clubs, iron bars, machetes, and other makeshift weapons to attack the Uyghur workers. Fighting spread between the dormitories, during which the 2 Uyghurs, by official count, were killed, and many people of unannounced ethnicity were wounded. Bystander videos show not so much, at least the videos that we have, show not so much a brawl between 2 sides, but rather hundreds of men surging up and down and milling about in a lane between the dormitory buildings. One video captures a scene of 2 men lying incapacitated on the ground, while several assailants strike them with clubs and large chunks of concrete. With dozens of observers milling about and lining the balconies of the buildings on either side of the lane, these 2 men are savagely beaten in unhurried fashion until each victim lies still. Following the Shaoguan incident, Chinese authorities announced that they had arrested Mr. Zhu. Images of fighting and pictures of many more bodies said to be Uyghur casualties, women among them, then circulated on the internet. Later, Chinese authorities claimed that these images were false and had been circulated by a member of the World Uyghur Congress, which is an umbrella organization of Uyghur groups outside of China headed by Rabia Qadir. Some Han workers involved in the factory fight itself, however, who spoke to Western reporters, also believed that the Uyghur death toll was higher than simply 2 from this clash. Uyghurs in Xinjiang and elsewhere thus suspected an official cover-up of the Shaoguan events. A week after the brawl, only Zhu and none of the men directly committing the violence had been arrested, despite the hundreds visibly involved in the widely circulated videos, or visible in the videos. With the Shaoguan workers cut off from outside communication in an undisclosed location, Chinese official media's attempts to put forth an authoritative version were widely discounted by both Han and Uyghur. And the readiness of both groups to believe rumors and independent internet accounts, text messages, and these kind of things, while distrusting official news media, is, I think, a noteworthy aspect of this whole series of events. Okay, on to the events of July 5th, the Urumqi demonstration, the riots, and their aftermath. So following the events in Shaoguan for the next week or more, Uyghur websites lit up not only with information and rumor, but also with poems, songs, open letters to authorities, and other materials generally deploring the violence, calling for investigations, questioning the unpopular labor transfer policy. Indeed, some of these concerns were even echoed by Chinese Communist Party officials, in particular the Guangdong Party Secretary Wang Yang, who suggested to a group of foreign reporters in Guangdong that China's ethnic policies needed rethinking. Xinjiang authorities remained silent on the issue, however. In the early days of July, Uyghurs planned a march to Urumqi's People's Square, and I've thrown up a not very good map, but it's a bit tricky reconciling one's memory and old maps and so on with Google Map versions of Urumqi, great as they are. But this will do. So they plan to march to Urumqi's People's Square to call for a more thorough investigation of the Shaoguan incident. Word spread over the internet, through cell phone texts, and other media. The upcoming event was well known in advance to many Uyghurs and others in Xinjiang, and throughout the world as well, and also presumably to the authorities. On Sunday, July 5th, around 5 a.m. Xinjiang time, people began gathering in the People's Square, or marching towards it. Some of the marchers waved large PRC flags, and there's a video that seems to show this march, and if this video is to be believed, at this point the marchers were rambunctious but peaceful. Most accounts number the initial demonstration at around 1,000. And then the demonstration was put down by security forces, either in or near People's Square. According to one unconfirmed report, the demonstrators had planned to stage a sit-in in the square and demand that authorities answer their questions about the Shaoguan incident. Once there, they were told to wait, and in an hour, someone would come and talk to them and answer their questions. But instead, police and paramilitaries moved in to surround them and began beating, detaining, and, according to some accounts, shooting at them. Demonstrators then called friends and relations elsewhere in the city and relayed news that their demonstration was being violently repressed, and this sparked the rioting elsewhere in the city. According to one report, after the demonstration was attacked by security forces, the crowd moved from People's Square southwest towards Nanmen, and from there south along Jiafang Lu, so just in this, obviously in this direction, towards Shanxi Hangzhe, which is a common name for a busy shopping area around between Nanmen and Ardaoqiao, down here, and in the area of one of the Rebbe Kader buildings. Now, what happened thereafter is much better known. It's been well documented, primarily because it was widely covered in the Chinese press and also in Western media. Chinese authorities moved with a remarkable dispatch to authorize the international press to fly into Urumqi and tour the scene a day or so after the riots. And they reported on vehicles and shops burned, Han bystanders attacked and killed. The final official death toll was 197, with some 1,000 wounded, most of them apparently Han. The images are very bloody. The stories of innocent people beaten, or in one case burned alive in their own shop, are very harrowing indeed. There's no doubt that Uyghurs went on a rampage and vented anger against Han shopkeepers and others living in areas adjoining Uyghur neighborhoods in Urumqi. Now, while Chinese and international media covered the violent attacks by Uyghur rioters on Han Chinese and on private and government property, there is another aspect of the events of that evening and the night of July 5th that is not documented in either Chinese or very much in foreign press at all. And that is what happened in clashes between Uyghur protesters or rioters and the police, armed police, military forces during the course of the repression of the riot. What we have to go on are scattered reports by visitors to Urumqi who have subsequently been interviewed outside of China. And I should say that a lot of these kinds of things, a lot of the stories that I'm telling are eyewitness accounts, but they are often not confirmed. We don't have multiple stories about similar incidents yet. There's really only a trickle of information that's come out. I got a lot of this from talking to reporters from RFA, but to RFA's credit, some of this material actually they have not reported yet because they can't get two or three sources on some of these things. Okay, so I'm going out beyond really where a responsible journalist would go in relating some of these stories. The reason I'm doing that is because the other side of the story is completely locked down and controlled from the Chinese media. And I think that it is at least important to get the suggestive. What am I down to? 2 minutes. All right, that's a problem. It's suggestive to get some of these out there. Okay, so according to the accounts, demonstrators were met not only with tear gas and truncheons and this sort of riot control, but also with armed gunfire and live ammunition. One place where bloody clashes are said to have occurred is the area around the Rabia Kadir building, which is marked there on the map, and south of there on the way to Ardaoqiao. According to one eyewitness report, riot police and Uyghurs fought there. According to another, by a young woman named Sakina Zulang, who was visiting Urumqi from her home in Canada, security forces pursued demonstrators here around 6 p.m. and opened fire at them along with crowds in the area. Zulang reports hearing gunfire and seeing 2 people fall to the ground shot after police arrived. She saw fighting with between police and Uyghurs. She fled with others and took refuge in a shop. And when she came out at 4 a.m. the next morning, she reported seeing blood on the streets and so many bodies that she had to step over them to make progress along the road. Later that same night, authorities shut off electricity to the city as a whole, or at least certain neighborhoods. After the electricity was cut, another incident reportedly took place in a complex of new apartment blocks in the neighborhood of Dawanxiang, which is down in this area somewhere. And there, reportedly, a large group of demonstrators or rioters were surrounded and confined. Neighbors in surrounding high-rise apartments report hearing a flurry of gunfire in the darkness and seeing cleaners scrubbing the streets at dawn the following morning. There were then house-to-house raids. Many men were taken out, and many of them were detained. The most disturbing cluster of stories concerns disposal of corpses. The source for the Dawan incident claims that bodies from the area between the apartments were lifted up by crane or bulldozer into trucks and driven off. Sakina Zulong told an RFA reporter of seeing security forces piling up corpses, piling up bodies. A Uyghur policeman reportedly told a Canadian Uyghur of being involved in an operation to burn corpses in an area in the Dawan area. Now, RFA staff heard multiple versions of this story. The numbers of corpses involved and the specific location was different in each of these stories. So again, it's something that they couldn't report on. All right. I will just jump to my conclusion then, and I will not talk about the Han vigilantism and the panic thereafter, which I think is better known. It was reported. We've seen those images. The needle stabbing panic is going to be talked about by Gardner Bovington in any case. As during the all right. We see how in each of these cases, in each of these violent incidents, official suppression of the news or control of the news may actually have caused more violence or created the conditions for the next stage, the next sequence of these events to take place. For example, suppression of the news about the extent of the crackdown against the Uyghurs following the riot may actually have allowed an impression to persist among Han Chinese in Urumqi that the state was in fact being too soft on the Uyghurs, and may have led to Han gangs going out in the next couple of days, in the sense that there had been no consequences for this riot. It was a rumor about Uyghur rapes of a Han woman at Shaoguan that led Han to attack Uyghur co-workers. It was a widespread belief that the Uyghur death toll from Shaoguan was officially downplayed that led to the Uyghur demonstration in Urumqi that in turn erupted into violence when Uyghur grievances were given no hearing. A false sense that among Han that the government had not responded robustly enough to the riots contributed to the vigilantism and Han attacks on Uyghurs, and later to the hypodermic panic and further angry Han demonstrations. With neither Han nor Uyghur seeing the state as a neutral arbiter or trusting official news sources, it's hard to see how the state can repair the tension that has left Urumqi segregated and Uyghur and Han communities more mutually distrustful than at any point in the past half-century of PRC rule.
So James gave a detail about the riots that happened on July 5th. I'm going to talk about from a different perspective, one of the cause of this riots, and also from a linguistic perspective, basically from Chinese democratic politics and the language policy in Xinjiang, and also whether the Uyghur can make the language as their core value of their ethnic identity. One of the cause, I think, from a linguistic perspective, is the policy, the language policy, and also democratic policy. It's the one of the Uyghurs' grievance for this going on riots, and also give a general background about the regions and the languages, cultures. So the topics I will be talking about. Basically, ethnic minorities and the social linguistic status of their language in Xinjiang, and the legal status of Uyghur languages as an official minority language in Xinjiang. Then the Chinese demographic politics in Xinjiang, and the restriction of the social function of Uyghur language, and the economic and the social opportunities for Uyghurs, and the linguistic rights and the core value of Uyghur language. This is a lot to be covered, but I will be very brief and given the time I have. Social linguistic background. So there are 13 ethnic minority living in Xinjiang, and mostly it's the Turkic languages, and the Uyghur is the dominant Turkic languages that spread out all of the Xinjiang. And the Chinese is the official language of the region, but Uyghur also is the official languages in the region as the legal status. And also it's the inter-ethnic languages for the Turkic people, like Kazakh, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, Tatar, and those other ethnic groups. The ethnic composition in 2005 statistics of the Uyghurs about 45%, and Han Chinese is about 40%. And other ethnic groups you see, it's next is the Kazakhs, and the largest group, and the Kyrgyz. But I will talk about this when I talk about the demographic factors and do some comparisons and the demographic changes in the recent years. The social linguistic set of the spoken languages, as I mentioned, the Uyghurs is the dominant languages, and for also it's the official instruction languages for elementary school, and the middle school, and also the university levels. And the Chinese is the same. And also, as I mentioned, the Uyghur also is the lingua franca for Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and even sometimes Shibo, and the Tajiks, other ethnic groups. The legal status of Uyghur languages, you can read from this, like in 1994, the Chinese government officially declared that all minority language nationalities should have the freedom and develop their languages and writing, and preserve and reform their traditional custom and relieve belief. And up to 1984, the regional autonomy law for the minority officially include the following preversion of the learning each other's languages. So autonomous region, such as in Xinjiang, the national autonomous area should educate and encourage cadres of various nationalities to study each other's languages, spoken and written languages. Cadres of Han nationality should study the spoken and the written languages that are commonly used in the locality concerned. So in this case, in general, in Xinjiang should be Uyghur, and in the other part of, like northern part of Xinjiang, like the Kazakh autonomous regions, Kazakhs, in the Kyrgyz autonomous oblast should be Kyrgyz. And also indicate the state personnel in the national autonomous area who have a good command or more than two spoken languages should be encouraged, rewarded. This is in 80s up to the language policy. And also today, I'm not going to, I only will talk about some of the problems, challenges that and the language policy causing. I'm not going to comment on the achievements Chinese have achieved educating, increasing the literacies. This probably is beyond this topic. Language policy and education. So implement the regional autonomous ethnic minorities stipulate in Article 37 that in schools where the majority of the students belong to an ethnic minority, language textbooks and instruction should be the language of that minority, and also contains permit, if the condition permits. So Chinese should be taught in the last 2 years of the primary schools and in the middle schools in order to promote the national languages. So up to 1990s, officially, there are 7 instructional languages, including Han Chinese, Uyghurs, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Mongolian, Shibo, Russians, and at primary and high school level. And Han Chinese and Uyghur, Kazakhs, Mongolian are used as instruction in college and the university level. In 1949, so Uyghur is about 80%, and Han Chinese is about 6%, 7%. But prior to 1949, it's about Uyghurs about more than 80%, and Han Chinese is about 5%. I have statistics, but because of the space, I didn't show that. And also, if you look at in 2003, the Uyghurs dropped to 45%, and Han Chinese increased to 40%. And you can see the other the changes of other ethnic minorities. So the problem of the minority has been one of the important areas for social and the cultural policy in China, especially in the front region like Xinjiang, is the ethnic balance and the linguistic situation have undergone dramatic changes. So like Uyghur, probably the dominant ethnic groups become minority. And also in this statistic, I didn't include the unofficial Han Chinese, and also the Bingtuan, one of the it's not including, so this is that is only registered. So if you look, probably Han Chinese more than 40%. So. So the dramatic, the demographic changes, so change the dynamic of the languages and the function of the languages. The Uyghur used to be the lingua franca in the region because of the economic and social changes. We gradually replaced by Chinese language. Also, I'll talk next factor. Talk about the restriction and the function of Uyghur languages. So this aspect of minority and the regional language is often the reason why speakers themselves shift to the majority languages. They feel their native language does not keep up with the modernity development. This is the Chinese government claiming that, as those who study Chinese minority policy, that minority languages like dragging the development of the ethnicity because of for the modern development. So one of the language policies is encourage and study Han Chinese in order to catch up with the development of the societies. And also, I'd like to tell a story about my own experience and to make some clarify some of the to explain some of the reasons what is happening changes. I grew up in Urumqi, and so I went to Han Chinese school. But at home I speak Kazakh. But if I go on the street, and also have to speak Uyghur. And also this is in late 70s and 80s. So as a Uyghur or Kazakhs, they're very proud of their languages, and even the concept of the Minzu in Uyghur is millat. Even is in China context, the minority is like it's a minority, but the concept is changed. The term Minzu or the millat in the Xinjiang context. So we are proud of being a millat because we still is a dominant ethnic group in the regions. So always the balance, because you have your language, your culture, is so isolated from the Han Chinese culture, so it's not that much impacting on languages. So and also at the time the Chinese policy, given the opportunity, especially in the 80s, so you can have a choice to go to schools. If you go to Uyghur schools, you can go all the way to university get educations. So there's not much pressure for minorities or ethnic group to pursue a Chinese. And also, it's for languages, when from the social linguistics is prestigious, and a lot of people living in Xinjiang also feel the prestige pride of their own languages. They don't feel like, oh, because of my language or my ethnicity, I'm a backward. But that's, I'm talking about in the past. And also people like, for example, this is the start, like if you go on a bus as a Uyghur or Kazakh, you speak Chinese, people will look at the difference and why you're speaking Chinese and feel like you are like being assimilated. And also at that time, compare with the Soviet policy, what's going on in the Soviet Union, especially Kazakhstan, we felt like always much better compared to them. And also at the university and everywhere, like work units. So always the language policy is that if you are a minority, Uyghur, Kazakh, and I think Chinese, everybody in China know that there's political studies every week. You divide it 2 sections. You have a choice, either go into the Uyghur sections or Han Chinese sections. So, and also there's like divisions, like I don't know if it's segregation, but it's a division. So too, like always, you don't feel pressure to have to study Chinese. University professors, a lot of professors graduated from Xinjiang University or other university, get education in the native languages. There's no need to study Chinese. There's no pressure. So I don't know the percentages, but a lot of professors at the Xinjiang University, I'm talking, so their Chinese language proficiency is not that high because then there's no need compared to in the other part of China. So this this only changed recently as the socio-economic development in Xinjiang, and especially after the collapse of Soviet Union, and also what happened in Yugoslavia, the Chinese policy in the Xinjiang region dramatically changed. So they pushed very hard about the bilingualism. So the bilingualism actually is the monolingual, basically promoting Han Chinese. So one of the incidents, just again back to Xinjiang University, as I said, when the past, as a Kazakh Uyghur, when you have like the meeting or conference, even with the Han Chinese, you are free to speak your languages, speak in Uyghurs. So in 2006, I went back to Xinjiang, and there's a reception for me, and try to meet with my colleagues there, and because there are some, mostly Uyghurs and Kazakhs, and there's some Tajiks and Han Chinese. So one of the shock was I felt like we are having this meeting, and everybody have to speak Chinese, and I felt sorry for those like. Some of my colleagues who never studied Chinese, they have to force to speak Chinese. And also the policy, people are like afraid of talking about the linguistic policy, what's going on. So this is like creating a lot of the grievancy, I think, causing one of the tensions. That's why the tension, the government policy, the harsh policy, dividing the people, just because language policy and the demographic policy. And also why I'm going to talk about the linguistic rights or core rights of Uyghur languages. It is mainly reflecting language attitudes, and can language turn into social prestiges or stigmatism varieties. So Uyghurs are very proud of their languages, and they feel like prestige, but now they're feeling threat. This is the first time, I think, in the last 20 years, Uyghur felt threat. Their language is under threat. This never happened in their own motherland. So the fact that in the multilingual situation, the individuals constantly making choice of the use of languages, so highlights the fact that language loss or the shift not primarily is a linguistic issue, but has to do with power, just like a Chinese language policy and the demographic policy, and also prejudice, and also unequal competitions. So it's the same thing in this country too, like affirmative actions, and in China so it's not the same background, the first competing with the same, so there's same background, so there's like an unequal balances for competing. And sometimes overt discriminations. So this is happening in Xinjiang. For example, if you don't have a language proficiency in Chinese, you are being discriminated. This can be interpreted like a racial discriminations because you don't know the languages. So that's and this is happened at Xinjiang University and also in a lot of schools. In order to be able to teach, in order to, for example, for the students studying at Xinjiang University, at a minority university, you have to have passed the proficiency test in Chinese. And at the same time, for example, if someone wants to go to graduate school, you have to pass, first for a minority, you have to pass the proficiency test in Chinese, then you have to pass the foreign languages. So you have to study 2 languages. So that's, I think that probably kind of discriminated or limited some of the opportunity for some of the minorities school. And also the job opportunity is the same thing. Sure, okay. So, and also the linguistic rights, also the discrimination, also the subordinations. So this leads to the minorities who seek therefore social and cultural, economic advancement to guide the minority, achieve the guide for the majority languages. Either they have to give up their languages or to switch to the main dominant languages. Yeah, I'm running out of time. It is. So following the break of the ethnic base and conflict after the dissolution of Soviet Unions and Yugoslavia, there's a response to the increasing demands for regional groups like Europe's and other places for more cultural and political rights. And the international community has increasingly dealt with promoting linguistic diversity and the minority rights by developing relevant standards concerning their minorities' language use. So China's policy towards the Uyghurs and the other minority in Xinjiang must be evaluated in the context of today's global standard that includes adopting the UN national towards the indigenous populations. So it should give the rights and the rights to the Uyghurs and also the not linguistic rights, but also linguistic rights also reflect to the other rights, ethnic identity, preserving culture, and preserving their traditions. Thanks.
I want to say this is an incredible turnout. The last time I saw a turnout like this, I was in Colombia, where a gentleman had arranged a similar event, and there were, again, people standing out doorways and looking in. This is, I think, an extraordinary comment on the increasing importance of the topics that were taken up tonight. And I think that's to the good. I should add that as I was coming in on the Shuttle Express today from SeaTac Airport, I was speaking to the very friendly cab driver, shuttle driver, who asked me what I did, and I said I work in an obscure part of the world and so forth, and I said Xinjiang and so forth. Talked a little bit, and then he said, "Is that where the Uyghurs are?" And I, wow, UW is doing its job. This is great. This is great. Well, I'd like to say that we're talking about matters that are of enormous importance. We're talking about literally deadly serious topics. And I'm going to use a bit of humor and irony to engage these topics. I want you all to understand that I mean no disrespect. I take these subjects very seriously. It's late in the evening, you're tired. Academic discussions can be tedious, so please do not mistake my humorous take on some of the events that I'm about to talk about as signs of disrespect or lightness. We've heard already about the events of June 5th and thereafter, actually beginning in Shaoguan. Jim helpfully attempted to provide some context to these events, although, of course, on their face they seem arresting enough that one might not actually feel the need to look for context. Talent then very nicely talked about some very important issues, the matter of linguistic rights, including those encoded in the Constitution and daily flouted in contemporary Xinjiang, and also the matter of cultural pride. the ability to feel that one possesses a valuable culture and language, and that one deserves and receives respect in society. And these are things that, in fact, many Uyghurs feel they do not enjoy today. So this context is very important. I want to move ahead to events that happened several months later, but were deeply embedded in this same structure. And let me begin by saying that there were, after Wang Yang helpfully said that there was a need to look at policies again, the Chinese government did come out with some comments. And one of the comments that they came up with was that it was possible to use stickers, happy stickers, to quell the tension. So here it says, for anyone still upset about the ethnic riots that killed nearly 200 people last month, Li Han says she has just the thing, yellow smiley face stickers bearing the slogan, "A smile is the common language of all nationalities." 1,800 people volunteered, they were recruited by the local Communist Party to hand out 100,000 of the stickers, helpfully to contribute to this effort, to ease tensions, make mutual hatred subside. They arranged dances and such. This was one way of dealing helpfully with the problem. I think it's safe to say it didn't work. You'll notice, those of you who can read well, and that means perhaps the front 2 rows, there's a very interesting comment at the bottom. The slogan on the yellow stickers is printed in both the Mandarin, Chinese, and Arabic languages. Now that's a typical mistake of a foreign journalist who doesn't quite understand what's going on. He might have said Uyghur or Kazakh, probably Uyghur, written in the Arabic script, as it has been for the last 20-odd years. Okay. I'm here, my remit here is to talk about the syringe attacks, which occurred in late August, early September. And I'd like to put a few questions to all of us, and in fact to the Chinese government and to the world community. Questions that we'd like to ask, things that we'd like to know about these syringe attacks. How many were there? Who perpetrated them? Why did the perpetrators, or the people accused of perpetrating them, choose this mode of attack? What were the medical consequences? And finally, what were the social consequences or the social implications of these attacks? And what I want to suggest is that a lot of these questions are hard to answer, and they're hard to answer for a number of reasons. But one of the main ones has already been identified by Jim, which is that the Chinese government has attempted to impose one version of events, and it has actively suppressed other versions. And I'm going to address that a little bit from a historical perspective at the end of my talk, if I'm speedy enough running through my slides that I don't get the dreaded 2-minute warning. By September 4th, according to the China Daily, Urumqi health and police authorities had confirmed 531 people had been stabbed by hypodermic syringes in the city. Now, this is a BBC rendering of an English-language Chinese daily newspaper, rendering a Chinese language source, rendering Chinese health officials. Confirmed 531 people had been stabbed by hypodermic syringes in the city. 171 of those showed obvious signs of the attacks. Okay? So you might ask yourself, what does confirmed mean? Xinhua, the national news agency, later suggested that many were suffering from mosquito bites or other psychogenic reasons. Okay? Ask yourself again, what does confirmed mean? I do not mean, again, to make light of the suffering of people who were actually stabbed. What I want to suggest is that there probably were a number of people stabbed, and there were a lot more people who were afraid of being stabbed, thought they might have been stabbed, worried very much about being stabbed, and that this grew from morbid rumors into actual hysteria in a very short time. And the context is one reason that it could grow into that. Okay, asking further, how many attacks were there? Other cities in Xinjiang had reports. There were 9 reported attacks in Hotan, of which 3 were actually involved prickings. In Altai, so Hotan is down south. In Altai in the north, 4 or 5 reported attacks turned out to be false alarms. In Kashgar, 3 of 5 were false alarms, said the China Daily again, quoting officials. Who committed the attacks? By September 11th, 45 suspects had been identified. 9 suspects had been recorded caught in the Hotan, Altai, and Kashgar districts. Now remember that we've already learned that 66% of the reported attacks in Hotan were judged to be false, and so forth, right? So suspects does not mean actual perpetrators, and I've used the different terms advisedly. There were 4 convicted in a trial that took place in Urumqi. And, geez, I've misspelled Urumqi there. The 4 were convicted of assault and carrying out actions that created an atmosphere of terrorism. And I think that's a key word to remember. Many of you may not be aware that one of the strategies the Chinese government adopted after September 11th was to change its tune from talking for years about Uyghur separatism and religious extremism to making placing a heavy emphasis on the idea of Uyghur terrorism, something that Jim has covered very nicely in a short piece available on the web. Next question: why did the perpetrators, that is to say, that subset of the suspects or other people unidentified, choose that mode of attack? Answer 1, we don't know. Answer 2, the accused were not given, and have not been given to this point, a chance to explain themselves. It goes without saying that those people who were brought up on trial and ultimately convicted of those charges were not given the opportunity to explain what they had done or why they'd done it. They were simply presented with the evidence. Okay? Why this mode of attack? Okay? Why would Uyghurs, assuming they were Uyghurs, have chosen to use pointy things? Okay? I want to suggest to you that many people will tell you in China that Uyghurs are known for what? 能歌善舞, right? Able to sing, good at singing, and skilled at dancing. But I venture to say that in the popular Han imagination, the reality of Uyghur identity is they're people with a penchant for pointy things. Oh no, my slides went away. Okay. Many people know, and in fact there is some basis to this, that many Uyghurs, the prevalence of drug abuse, including IV drug abuse, is rather high among Uyghurs, and directly as a consequence of this, there is a high prevalence of AIDS in the Uyghur community, right? So that just given that simple social fact, which is sadly a social fact, and a colleague, Jay Doucher, has written an excellent piece on public health problems in Xinjiang, it would not be a crazy thing to worry if you found a Uyghur man with a pointy thing that looked like a syringe, that it might contain either drugs or be tainted, either contain drugs or be tainted with HIV, in which case this would be a very, very scary thing to encounter. Second thing, of course, would be kebab, right? Kebabs that Uyghurs sell in many of the cities of China. And I had very nice images. I really regret that the images didn't come up. Oh, I know why that happened. Different iterations of my PowerPoint. It was my fault. So the kebab skewer, of course, can be used to poke someone, and I'm not speaking out of turn. You'll see why later. And then the third thing, of course, what other famous object associated with Uyghurs has a pointy end to it? Knives. Pchak, right? Knives. Uyghurs are famous for making beautiful knives, and it's considered virtually an element of the code of Uyghur cultural participation to, if you're a man, to carry a knife on your person. So these 3 pointy objects are associated with Uyghurs by Han Chinese. And again, not without basis. What have been the social consequences? Again, a story suggested that they provoked more panic than actual injuries. Again, one of the major concerns raised by the Han Chinese in these groups was the government is not protecting us. By the reports coming from various quarters, they actually shouted that the government was useless. They demanded that the government better protect them, and they in fact shouted Wang Leqian Xiatai, right? That Wang Leqian, the party secretary in Xinjiang, the most powerful person in the province, should leave his post. There are several reports, who knows whether they are reliable, but from sources that I respect, that suggest when Wang Leqian appeared on a balcony to address the assembled masses of people demanding that the government do something about it, people lobbed plastic bottles at him, which is about as disrespectful as you can get. You might remember that on June 4th, people dropped Xiaoping on the ground, right? They dropped little bottles to indicate that their disrespect for Deng Xiaoping, right? In any case, they were showing Wang Leqian, they thought nothing of him, right? Wang Leqian was the target, but Li Zhi, unfortunately, ended up being, I think, the fall guy. The party secretary in Urumqi was sacked by Beijing. As an indication that Beijing found the handling of these problems unacceptable. The power of rumor is such that this became imitatable, so that days after that Han demonstration, a peasant named Mr. Wang in Hulu Township in eastern Xinjiang claimed to have been stabbed. The Yiwu County Police Constabulary rushed to the scene within 15 minutes of receiving the report, did a thorough investigation, and within 3 hours they determined that he had no signs of having been stuck with a syringe, and they later detained him for having been drunk and disorderly. He got drunk and he thought of a good story that would really sell well. It didn't stop there. On September 16th, someone claimed to have been stuck with a co-op skewer. There it appears for you. On a bus in Xi'an, one of the largest cities in central China. Closed-circuit television, I don't understand how this is possible, confirmed that there was an attack by a male resident of Wutai Township. Means were not named, but it seems pretty likely that it was in fact Han. On the spot, 4,000 police were deputed. 14,000 police were placed on high alert. Okay, 38,000 civil militia volunteered to help maintain public order after one reputed co-op skewering, right? There was a month-long campaign to maintain safety on buses. Police mounted the buses. This is kind of like a bus marshal program, if you think about post-9/11 air safety here. And 50 closed-circuit televisions, cameras were operating 24 hours a day, every day. This is the government report. So this is an indication of how seriously the government took the damage that these rumors could cause and the damage that imitations could cause. There were even rumors that stickers, people with pointy things, were going to Beijing and trying to do copycat crimes. In any case, what I want to suggest to you is there probably were a core of people who actually got stuck. I believe actually that the case of those the dreaded 2-minute warning, those 4 men who were convicted in Urumqi probably did in fact stick the person that they were accused of having stuck. But I think many more cases were in fact signs of hysteria. Okay, very, very quickly, I promised to talk a little bit about social implications and historical analogies. Those of you who are in the business of doing Chinese history, and I know several in this room, will know the work Soul Stealer by Philip Kuhn and Treason by the Book by Jonathan Spence. These are both intriguing books. Let me very quickly talk about what I'm thinking of. And this is type too small for anyone to read. So, Soul Stealers, Philip Kuhn's book, talked about a hysteria in 1768 in which people were reported to have been stealing other people's souls by cutting their queues, their long hair, writing the names of those people on pieces of paper. Those accused included laborers rebuilding a sluice gate, I'll come back to them in a moment, mendicants, poor people with accents identified as belonging to the locus of reported trouble, Buddhist monks who were always liminal with their begging bowls and so forth. The laborers rebuilding the sluice gate were known to have a difficult job driving piles into the riverbed, and it was widely understood that if you took the names and therefore the souls of ordinary citizens, you could gain more force to drive the piles into the water, right? So this, if you stole souls, you could actually drive the piles in better. So naturally, people who worked on the sluice gate were suspect. The process of accusation and prosecution went in this way. There was a public outcry. Information about this got up to the emperor. The emperor announced that there would be prosecutions. People would be found guilty. Therefore, officials understood that their own necks were on the line. They found guilty parties. They apprehended large numbers of people, including witnesses. They tortured them all in order to produce truth. This should be familiar to us these days. And there were, in fact, convictions. Philip Kuhn called this episode a premonitory shiver, a warning about the future, a vision of sorcerers roaming the land, stealing the souls. I ask you to consider for the moment whether this is a premonitory shiver of further events in Xinjiang. Finally, very quickly, I'm probably negative 30 seconds at this point, Jonathan Spence's brilliant book, Treason by the Book, talks about an episode a little bit earlier in the Qing, about the 1720s, in which a literatist named Zheng Jing wrote an anti-Manchu tract. When local officials got wind of this, oh no, they thought, better memorialize the emperor, which they did. The emperor thought, yes, we need to take care of this. Not only track down copies of the book, but also track down the people who circulated it, found the literary antecedents, found the students of the people who drew literary antecedents. Them also took the step of to review the statement of that book. Large on Jing's original. In other words, the Qing emperor boldly allowed this transgressive person, this treasonous person, to have his own say in the book. This is not happening in Xinjiang. Okay, and I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much. I don't have any pictures, so you'll have to watch me. What I will talk about actually is only marginally related to the main topic of tonight, to understand what went on in Xinjiang in July and afterwards. It is more than anything else, it is an effort on my part to understand how these events were received and discussed in Turkey, in Turkish media, and also in official circles. When Professor Dong asked me if I would participate in this panel, I was still in Turkey, and I really jumped on the opportunity because for the reasons that I will try to explain, I found some of the reaction in Turkey very hard to understand, and I still am troubled by some of it. But I have thoughts about it, and I will share them with you. I will not speak for too long. I don't want the person between you and your friend. So, so, so early July, as these events broke up in Xinjiang, there were seemingly spontaneous demonstrations in several cities across Turkey, both in Istanbul, the biggest city in the country, but also in some provincial towns. People went out and they demonstrated. There were banners in solidarity with our kinsmen in Eastern Turkestan. That's how the place is referred to in Turkey. And also there were protests in front of the Chinese embassy. Black laurels were left, and there were symbolic prayers for the people who were killed. And there was also surprisingly official condemnations. Prime Minister, in an outburst, called that what the Chinese were doing was a genocide. Now, this is coming, of course, from a prime minister who was even reluctant to use the word massacre when he talks about what happened to Armenians in 1940. So this was a bit puzzling too. And there were calls for boycott of Chinese goods, and people attacked the stores and they took out toys and they burned them on the streets. So of course, it is already paid for, so it didn't really hurt the Chinese that much. So, but this is. This was so both of them were going on at the same time. Now the problem, why I didn't understand this very well, was if you ask the average Turk, even those with advanced degrees, most of them would be hard pressed to find a place on the map, know the difference between Eastern and Western Turkestan, because if Turkestan is the place where Turks live, then Western Turkestan could conceivably be the rest of the world, because there are Turks in many different parts of the world. And also, of course, the history of the place is virtually unknown in Turkey. But of course, there were banner headlines, and there were stories, some of them from the press, some of them rumors. Now, it is true, though, I have to say, that every Turkish child, when they start school, one of the first things that they are presented with is a map. This map shows Central Asia, and there are sort of 6 or 7 arrows that grow from Central Asia, and they go all over the world. And the point of this map is that the entire world civilization originated in Central Asia, but it was Turkish in essence. So not only Turkey, but also Egyptian civilization, the Chinese civilization, the European civilization. So the arrows somehow from Central Asia reached the rest of the world and shape the entire world history. And around the symbol for the Turkish presidency, now there are 16 stars, and they're supposed to represent the 16 Turkish states that were established in history. But again, if you ask an average Turk, they would be hard-pressed to count 2 or 3 Turkish states that were found. So this is a pseudo history. It's very confusing, and it is, if you look at it carefully, these arrows and where they went, of course, the names of Turkic tribes, the Mongolian tribes, the Chinese states, they are all mixed up with each other. But nevertheless, this is repeated so much that it is in the background of most Turks now, that they know that map and they know the arrows very well. I think this is almost like suspending belief. It's almost like going to church on Sunday and praying and reading the Bible and then going back on Monday and teach Darwin at the same time. So there is that kind of similarity. One manifestation of this was there are some very famous, well-received comic books when I was growing up in Turkey. And there were superheroes here with Central Asian-sounding names. And they did all these things. They fought the Chinese, they fought the Greeks, they fought the Slavs, and sometimes one episode covered hundreds of years and thousands of miles of territory. But this was kind of a jumbled up history that people kind of consumed and didn't think about it that much. So that's the background, and I think there was something about this background that prompted some of these demonstrations. But historically, there are some real interactions, of course, between these two geographies. Not enough to create a common consciousness and common history, a common identity, but that there are some interesting episodes. I'm not going to go into details here, but two of them I want to mention very quickly. In 1865, when an independent state was founded in what is now Xinjiang, there was, in 1865, this state actually sent an emissary to the Ottoman state. And then the Ottoman emperor, Ottoman Sultan at the time was very influenced by this, and he sent some weapons and ambassadors, and this was celebrated widely in what is now Xinjiang. And then even coins were struck in the name of the Ottoman Sultan. And sometimes in history books this is interpreted as saying that the place kind of joined the Ottoman Empire. But of course this ended with the death of Yaqub Bey, who was the leader of this state. So this is an interesting interaction. But again, in Turkish history, in Ottoman history, this is not mentioned at all, because that history in the 19th century was written with almost exclusively Westernization and Europe in mind. The other interesting interaction is at the end of the empire, when one of the leaders of the Young Turks actually, once the Ottoman Empire lost World War I, he fled the country and ended up in Central Asia, trying to form an Islamic empire, gathering these Turkic groups and communities and starting a jihad against the Bolsheviks. And that ended in disaster, and he was killed in 1920. But that, of course, is not mentioned that much in much of the official history, because that part of history is seen as really very problematic. The entire history is told in terms of liberation and what happened in rest of Turkey. So, so these are kind of confusing histories. And I think it is wrong to look for proximity and affinity and knowledge in explaining these kind of spontaneous and official reactions to what was happening in China at the time, last summer. And I think there are two factors that were instrumental here. One of them, I think, has to do with a certain degree of self-confidence on the part of Turkish state in recent years. Now, Turkey has been going through some kind of an economic growth, and it didn't even suffer that much from the recent crisis, because its banking system is very heavily controlled and supervised. So it is a very, in that sense, and then it is now part of the G20 countries. So there is a self-confidence, and there is an attempt on the part of the Turkish government now to strike a more independent kind of policy, more Eastern-looking perhaps, in addition to being close to the West and the United States. And they do a lot of unexpected-looking things in order to assert this, in terms of coming out in support of what was going on, in support of Palestinians, or getting into arguments with Israel. But I think this kind of reaction in support of this Turkic community was seen as another example of this. So this is a reflection of this self-confidence. But I think more interestingly, I think a lot of the spontaneous demonstrations, and they were the most visible ones, were staged by people who are, in a way, left out of this economic transformation. So people here are talking about this jobless recovery, and that's what has been going on in Turkey too. It's a very high unemployment rate, a very large number of people who are uneducated and not very well educated and unemployed with no hopes. And we see different examples of these kinds of easy mobilization against ethnically organized politics and movements. So I see that more than, in fact, the official reaction, which is in some ways can be seen as pandering to this broader nationalist sentiments in the country. So I see this more as a reflection of this massive kind of discontent and fear and discomfort that people are, large numbers of people are feeling. And what also has become very clear very quickly, and the things that actually died down in Turkey relatively quickly, quickly because it became quickly very clear that what the Uyghur people are suffering in China in some ways is not that different what's going on from what's going on with the Kurdish community in Turkey. In one-to-one, actually, you can find parallels in terms of the language policies, in terms of restrictions, in terms of all the examples that we've read. So, and then, of course, the whole genocide statement was really bizarre. So all these things kind of created this very uncomfortable solution. And not to mention, and this is the last thing I will say, it just had happened that 1 week before these riots broke out, Turkish president with a very large group of businessmen had visited China, and they had signed a very huge trade agreement with the Chinese government, more than $3 billion. And they are, and that's part of this kind of policy of having more connections in the East and in China, and they're very frightened that these kinds of connections will be endangered. So I think I'll...
By Talent Mohanuli. Mohanuli is a specialist in Central Eurasian Turkic languages and cultures, especially in Turkic Sino-linguistics. He teaches currently in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at the University of Washington. He has a PhD in Turkic linguistics and Central Asian studies from Indiana University, and he has taught Turkic languages and cultures for the past 16 years at Indiana, Wisconsin, and the University of Washington. He's a native of Urumqi, and he has traveled extensively throughout all the Turkic language-speaking areas in China doing field work on Kazakh, Tuvan, Uyghur, and other Turkic languages. And he has published articles and books on sociolinguistic aspects of the Tuvan and Kazakh language situations. Our third speaker will be Gardner Bovington. Gardner Bovington is an assistant professor in the Department of Central Eurasian Studies at Indiana University. He specializes in the study of nationalism and the politics of identity, with a regional focus on Xinjiang, and more broadly on East Asia and Central Asia. He has conducted nearly 2 years of field work in Xinjiang over the course of 1995 to 2002, using both Chinese and Uyghur languages. He has published his research findings in journal articles and book chapters, and has just completed a book manuscript on the politics of contemporary Xinjiang, forthcoming from Columbia University Press. Our final panelist, who probably needs less introduction than any of the others, is Professor Rashad Kasaba, who's the Henry M. Jackson Professor of International Studies at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. He's the author and editor of several books and many articles dealing with the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, and the Middle East. His most recent publications are A Movable Empire, Ottoman Nomads, Migrants, and Refugees, 2009, from University of Washington Press, and he's the editor of the Cambridge History of Modern Turkey, which is volume 4 in that series. Without further ado, let's welcome the panelists, and James Millward in particular.
I'm going to recap in a little more detail than David just did what we know and what we suspect happened in June of July last summer, June and July of 2009. I'm going to go pretty fast because David told me he's going to be strict about time, and that's a good thing to do. So, it's not a simple matter to recap these events, because from the time the events occurred, all concerned have tried to shape the narrative in ways to support their own political interpretation. This is, of course, nothing new. What makes it significant in this instance is the way the interplay of information in both new and old media and information control have contributed to the violence and led to its continuation in several stages from June through August and September, from Guangdong to Xinjiang. Now, of course, most of the power over communications and information lies with the Chinese state, which mobilized its print and broadcast media to present an official version of events, namely that the World Uyghur Congress used the unfortunate events in the factory in Guangzhou to incite a violent riot in Xinjiang. And also, and the Chinese state has also been able to implement a remarkable and possibly unprecedented effort at a full spectrum media control, communications control in Xinjiang since July 7th. all internet, including email, Skype, Twitter, QQ, Flickr, and other sorts of services like that, and international phone and SMS services have been cut off for months from the region. People have been closely monitored going in and out with reports of searches at the border for digital media and other things like that. House-to-house searches have been carried out widely in Urumqi, and reportedly cell phones, cameras, and anything that can record video have been confiscated. And only a small amount of information other than the official story has come out of Xinjiang. In part, this is aided by cell phone and video posted on YouTube and elsewhere. But this small amount of information, although it is limited and sometimes problematic, hints at aspects that are left out of the official story. All right, I want to be
many years. So that's the immediate context for this symposium, and we have 4 incredibly distinguished panelists to discuss this from a variety of perspectives. I will provide all their introductions now, and we will proceed, or I'll introduce them in the order that they will speak, and we'll proceed with the program. We'll have about 10 or 15 minutes presentation by each panelist, and then we'll go to questions and answers. Our first speaker will be James Millward. James Millward is Professor of Intersocietal History in the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He specializes on the modern history of China and Central Asia, including Mongolia, Tibet, and especially Xinjiang. He also teaches world history, and his current research combines Central Eurasia and world perspectives by following the paths of stringed instruments and musical exchanges along the Silk Roads and globally, with a particular focus on the globalization of the guitar over the past 500 years. His publications include, and many of you know particularly his most recent work, Crossroads of Eurasia, A History of Xinjiang, Columbia University Press, 2007, New Qing Imperial History, The Making of Inner Asian Empire at Qing Chengde, from Rutledge Corzon in 2004, and Beyond the Past, Economy, Ethnicity, and Empire in Qing Central Asia, 1759-1864, from Stanford University Press. He will be followed On July 5, 2009, rioting broke out in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang, after days of rising tension between Uyghurs, the dominant or the largest ethnic group in Xinjiang, and Han Chinese, the dominant ethnic group in China. The clashes began when the police confronted a protest march held by Uyghurs to demand a full government investigation of a brawl between between Uyghur and Han workers in a toy factory on June 25th in Shaoguan, Guangdong Province, 1,800 miles away from Xinjiang. 2 Uyghur men were killed and 120 injured in the violence at the factory. Many Uyghurs believe that the government did too little to investigate the incident, and anger about the government's perceived lack of action was the spark leading to the renewed violence in Urumqi on July 5th. At least 197 people were killed and 1,600 injured, most of them Han civilians, when Uyghurs went on a rampage that night, according to the government, the Chinese government. Vengeful Han then attacked Uyghurs over the next few days. Many Uyghurs in Urumqi say the government has severely undercounted the Uyghur casualties. Even the official casualty toll makes this the deadliest outbreak of violence in China in